Hey, stop scrolling. I need you to hear this. Because what happened to me last Thanksgiving is the kind of thing that changes a family forever. And I'm still not sure if it ended in healing or just a very expensive ceasefire. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 26 years old, standing outside my childhood home in the freezing cold, luggage at my feet, staring at a door that had just been closed in my face by my own mother. Thanksgiving. The one holiday that's supposed to be about family, about gratitude, about coming together. And I was literally locked out, not metaphorically. The deadbolt turned. I heard it click, and then silence. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what nobody in that warm, candlelit house full of turkey and tension knew. My sister had put me in charge of every single dollar of her $3 million inheritance. Every single dollar. And they were about to find out. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand the Thanksgiving without understanding the years that built it. I was always the difficult one. At least, that's the story my family told. My older sister Vivienne, she was everything a parent could want. Quiet, beautiful, obedient, a straight-A student who became a successful architect and married a man our mother picked out at a church fundraiser. I, on the other hand, was the one who asked too many questions, who left home at 19, who showed up to Christmas in ripped jeans, and left early because I couldn't breathe in that house for more than 4 hours, without feeling like something inside me was slowly dying. My parents never said they loved her more. They didn't have to. It lived in the way my mother's face relaxed when Viv walked into the room, versus the way her jaw tightened when she saw me. It lived in the college fund they set up for Viv, and the loan they expected me to pay back. With interest. Family interest, they called it, as though that was something people actually do. It lived in every family photo where I was placed slightly to the side, slightly out of the light, slightly adjusted out of the center of the frame. I made peace with it. Or I told myself I did. You spend enough years rewriting your own story, and eventually the edited version starts to feel like the truth. But Viv and I, we were close in a way that had nothing to do with our parents. Underneath the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, the woman who ironed her pillowcases, Viv was quietly unraveling. She'd call me at midnight sometimes, whispering so her husband couldn't hear, and she'd say things like, "I don't know who I am anymore." She'd ask me how I did it, how I left, how I survived without their approval, how I built something real without their blueprint. I didn't have great answers, but I always picked up the phone. 3 years ago, Viv was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. She was 34. The disease moved fast in the beginning, faster than anyone expected, and she made decisions quickly, the way people do when they suddenly understand that time is not a guarantee. She left her husband, she sold the house, she simplified, and then she came to me with a legal document and a look on her face I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Clarity, maybe. The kind that only comes after enormous loss. Our grandmother had left Viv her entire estate. $3 million in assets, investments, property. Our parents had assumed for years that when the time came they would have some control over it, because that's how they operated. Control was their love language, but our grandmother had known better. She'd watched our family for decades, and she'd written the will that put everything into a trust, and she left the executor decision to Viv alone. Vivi chose me, not our father, who had a finance background and had been not so subtly angling for the role for years. Not our mother, who referred to the inheritance as Vivienne's safety net, in a tone that always made it sound like it was partly hers. Me. The difficult one, the one with the ripped jeans and the early exits and the loan they charged interest on. She said, "You're the only person in my life who's never wanted anything from me." I signed the paperwork. I told no one. For 2 years, I managed that trust quietly, responsibly, in a way that I think would have genuinely surprised my parents if they'd known. I brought in a financial advisor. I protected the assets. I made decisions based entirely on what Viv told me she wanted for her future, a future she was determined to build on her own terms, despite everything her body was starting to do. Our parents didn't know. Viv didn't tell them, and neither did I. It wasn't a secret born of malice. It was a secret born of self-preservation. We both knew what would happen the moment that information entered my parents' house. It would become ammunition. It would become leverage. It would become the subject of a family meeting where everyone spoke very calmly and said very civilized things that were actually just elaborate ways of saying, "We want control of this," so we kept it quiet. And then came last Thanksgiving. I should give you context on why I was even invited. My parents and I had been in one of our extended Cold Wars. We cycled through them every 18 months or so, a pattern so predictable I'd started to recognize the signs the way you recognize weather. This particular freeze had started the previous spring when I declined to attend my cousin's wedding because it fell on the same weekend as a work commitment I couldn't break. My mother had called me selfish. I'd said something I probably shouldn't have. A door had been closed. Not literally, not yet, and we'd spent 7 months communicating through Viv in that passive, performative way families do when they're too proud to just say what they mean. Viv was the one who brokered the peace. She'd called me in October and said, "Please come, I need you there. I'm not doing well, and I need to see you, and I can't do a holiday with just them." Her voice had that particular exhaustion in it that I'd learned to take seriously. I said yes. I drove 4 hours. I brought wine and flowers and the good candles because I always overcompensate when I'm nervous. I stood at the front door of my childhood home and knocked, because something in me couldn't bring myself to just walk in the way I used to. My mother opened the door, looked at the flowers, looked at me, and said, "I'm sorry, we decided to keep this year small, just immediate family." I said, "I am immediate family." She said, "You know what I mean." I stood there for a moment, waiting for something, a laugh, a tell, some signal that this was a misunderstanding, a bad joke, a moment that was about to correct itself. But my father appeared behind her and put his hand on her shoulder and looked at me with this expression that managed to be both apologetic and unbothered at the same time. The face of a man who had made peace with being unkind by calling it boundaries. The door closed. The deadbolt clicked. I stood in the cold for probably 4 minutes. My body didn't know what to do. Cry, leave, knock again, laugh. My brain was doing that thing it does when something absurd happens, trying to process it through every possible framework before landing on the one that's just, "This is really happening." I called Viv. She didn't pick up. I texted her, "I'm outside." She replied 6 minutes later, "I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I'm coming out." She came out in her socks. The ground was frozen and she didn't care. She just came out and wrapped her arms around me, and I could feel how much effort it took her. The slight tremor in her hands. And I held on and thought about how unfair it is that the best people are always the ones the world is hardest on. We sat in my car for an hour, the heat running, the radio off. Viv in her socks telling me everything that had happened in the lead up to this. The conversation our parents had apparently been having for weeks about boundaries and difficult energy, and protecting the peace of the holiday, the way they decided that uninviting me was an act of love somehow, an act of protecting the family from conflict, as though I were a weather system, as though my presence were something to be managed rather than welcomed. And then Viv said something that shifted everything. She said, "They've been asking me again about grandmother's money. Dad wants to be brought in as a co-advisor. Mom keeps saying they just want to help me protect it." I looked at her. She looked at me. She said, "I think it's time they know. I want to be really honest with you about what happened next, because I've seen versions of this story told online where the person becomes some kind of revenge hero and everything is deeply satisfying and clean. Real life is messier than that, and I think you deserve the messy version." We went back inside. Together, Viv walked in first, and I walked in behind her, and my mother turned from the kitchen and her face did something complicated, and my father set down his drink, very slowly. Nobody said anything for a moment. Viv sat down at the table. I stood, and Viv, in the quietest, most composed voice I have ever heard come out of a human being, said, "I need to tell you both something about grandmother's estate, about who manages it, and why." She told them everything, the trust, the executor, my name on every document, 2 years of decisions, 2 years of responsibility, 2 years of me showing up for their other daughter in ways that were invisible to them because they'd never thought to look. My mother's face went through about 11 different emotions in the span of 40 seconds. My father asked 3 clarifying questions in a tone that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not succeeding. And then my mother said, and I will never forget this as long as I live. She said, "Why would she choose you?" Not angry, not accusatory, just genuinely, deeply confused, as if the information did not compute, as if the data refused to load because it contradicted everything she'd stored about who I was. I said, because I never needed anything from Viv except for her to be okay. The silence after that was the longest silence I have ever experienced at a dinner table, and I have experienced some long silences at dinner tables. We stayed for dinner. It was not a warm dinner. It was not a Hallmark movie reconciliation with tears and hugs, and somebody saying I never realized. It was turkey and strained conversation, and my mother refilling her wine glass twice, and my father asking me, eventually professional questions about the structure of the trust as though we were colleagues at a networking event. But something cracked open in that room. I don't know what to call it. Not healing. Healing takes so much longer than one evening, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But an acknowledgement, maybe. A moment where the story they'd been telling about me, the difficult one, the one who didn't fit, the one you lock out in the cold, bumped up against a version of me they didn't have a category for, and they had to feel that collision, whether they wanted to or not. Viv squeezed my hand under the table twice during dinner. Just twice. Quick, small, like Morse code for, "I see you. I'm sorry. Thank you." That was enough. I drove home that night with the heater running and a strange feeling in my chest that I'm still trying to name. It wasn't triumph. This was never about winning. It wasn't closure. That would imply something finished that still feels very much ongoing. Maybe it was just the particular exhaustion of being finally, fully, undeniably seen by people who had spent years choosing not to look. My parents called me the following week. My mother cried. My father apologized in that careful, structured way men of his generation apologize, with acknowledgement but very little vulnerability. It was not everything, but it was more than I'd ever gotten before. Viv is doing okay. Some days are harder than others, and I drive up when she needs me, and we sit in her apartment and watch bad television, and she bosses me around about the trust, and I let her. Because honestly, she's usually right, and every time someone asks me what Thanksgiving is about, I think about sitting in that cold car in my childhood driveway, and Viv coming out in her socks, and the way love, real love, doesn't always live in the open door. Sometimes it lives in the person who runs out to meet you when the door gets closed. If you're the one who keeps getting locked out of your own family's warmth, I want you to know something. The people who see you clearly are worth more than the people who made you. And sometimes being the difficult one just means you were always the one asking the right questions in a house that didn't want to answer them. I see you. I hope you had somewhere warm to go.